And welcome everyone to Bava Metzia. This is a new Masechet. Masechet Bava Metzia is sponsored by Rabbi Art Gould in memory of his beloved bride of 50 years. Just moved. Carol J. Robinson. Harina Gula Bat Huda V'Yehuda Tzvi. Rabot Banot Asuchayel Va'at Alit Al Kulan. Today's stuff is sponsored by Heather Stone in loving memory of her father, Bob Stone, Yehuda Le Ben Naftali Halevi on his second yahrzeit. He taught me Hebrew and how to daven. He loved Jewish learning, was proud of his Jewish faith. As I learned the daf every day, I know I am carrying a tradition that would make my dad proud. Okay, with that, we're going to get started. A few words of introduction. First of all, we have bookmarks. If you didn't order the bookmarks for Nezikin, then please order them now. You can get a whole set of all the Masechtot and Nezikin. They're bookmarks that both have a checklist, so you can check off all the dapim that you've done. And also they have, more importantly, musagim, concepts that appear within the Masechet and their explanations. And obviously it's a bookmark, so you can always keep your place. So if you order them and some reason didn't receive them, the mail system seems to be pretty bad these days. Please let us know. I just got back now one that we sent way back when Bava Papa started, literally yesterday. So please let us know. And if you'd like to order them, you can go on to today's daf. Also for the next few days, it'll be up on the daf post, how to order them. And also there's a PDF of them. So if you want to just have it electronically, you could do that also, and they're free of charge. So feel free to order. Okay, Masechet Bava Metzia. We have two fabulous introductions on the website, one by Gita Neufeld, with all sorts of details about what you can expect in this Masechet and some background information that will help you to understand various things in the Masechet, terms defined, other such things. And Dr. Ayelet Libson also has an introduction, which is video, audio, and you can hear about some background to the Masechet and a perspective on the whole Masechet. We don't always have time to do this. I'll go very quickly into what types of things we might find in this. First two chapters, we're going to talk about lost items, although we're going to talk about this today, how we kind of get into lost items in a bit of a strange manner. It's something that Ayelet pointed out in her Shiur, and I will go back to what she said. And then we get into Shomrim, when you're watching someone else's item, which we already started getting into somewhat in Bava Kama. We're going to really head on tackle that topic. We're going to get into money, different currency issues that come up with money, ona'ah, about selling things for too high a price, about interest, taking interest, which is forbidden. Then we're going to get into relationships between seller and, employer and employee. Very interesting. And that'll lead us toward the end. There's some other things at the end of the Masechet, but basically the idea is going to be, as opposed to the previous Masechet, and we'll talk about this a little bit at the Siyum as well on Sunday. If you haven't registered, feel free to register still. The Bava Kama was all about damages. Bava Metzia is much more about typical everyday relationships between people and things that happen in typical relationships, whether it be two people finding the same lost item, or a buyer, a seller, or somebody watching someone else's object, or when we get to employer-employee relationship and things that could go wrong, claims that people can make, and basically trying to figure out. And really, we're going to start off today with a big case of doubts. Okay, doubtful situation, when you don't know who something belongs to. What do we do? How does a court rule in terms of, someone might be lying, someone might not be lying, they both might be right. How do we know how to deal with the situation in a court of law? So we're going to start with that. Shnaim ochazim b'tallit. Ze omer ani metzatia. Oh, and maybe I should do some background if some people are new to the whole Gemara in general. First of all, we have all sorts of resources on our site. There's a getting started page. There's a beginner's class if you're interested in getting some more background on Gemara. That's a digital course that you can just do on your own. All our resources are free of charge. There's also there's a Zoom every morning at 7:15 Israel time, which could be nighttime by you, depending on where you live. So if you'd like to join that, there's also a WhatsApp group with the Zoom. There's one that people ask questions and more have discussions on, and one is really just for sending out announcements. If, for example, it happened this week for the first time, I couldn't teach this week, so sent out announcements there. So if you do want to join the Zoom, good to be on that group, because there was a person or two who said to me, why is the Zoom not working this week? So it's important to be on the Zoom group to be able to get the announcements about that. And we send out links to the daf every day. There's admin-only groups, which basically just send out the links every day. And there's also weekly shiurim that other women give that also are sent out in the WhatsApp group, which reminds me that also Alana Stein-Hain also has a shiur, an in-depth din and daf this week that's on the first daf of Bava Metzia. So with that, let's get started. Shnaim ochazim b'tallit. This is a very famous Mishnah. So two people are holding on to a tallit. Okay, it could be a tallit, it could be anything, it could be, a tallit doesn't necessarily mean a tallit, what we think of a tallit, but some garment. They're fighting over it. Ze omer ani metzatia, v'ze omer ani metzatia. One says, I found this item, and the other one says, I found this item. And they're both holding on. Now, notice the word ochazim. It's a very important word. See in the Gemara, they're going to take this very seriously. They're both holding on to it. Ze omer kula shali. This one says it's completely mine. V'ze omer kula shali. The other one says it's completely mine, even though each is only holding half. Okay, so before we even get to what the halacha is, already the first thing the Gemara is going to jump on, which is ani metzatia. Is this two different cases? This one says I found it. This one says I found it. This one says it's all mine. This one says it's all mine. So the Gemara is going to ask, is this one case? Is this two cases? In the end, they're going to conclude it's two different cases. But already, I'll point out that the Gemara is going to struggle with the language in the Mishnah. Now, when we learn Gemara, you have to remember, the Gemara is coming to explain the Mishnah, but it doesn't mean that the Gemara is the only way to explain the Mishnah. The Gemara has a particular way they want to explain the Mishnah, and perhaps they also want to teach you certain other things, and they want to get to other certain conclusions. But it's possible that the Mishnah was written in this way so that you really get into the fight between the people. When you have a fight with someone, this one talks, then that one talks. This one talks, that one talks. And it just could be a very typical conversation between two people who are fighting. I found it. I found it. It's mine. It's mine. And that actually is a pretty typical way of saying it. But the Gemara is not going to be satisfied with that answer. The Gemara isn't even going to suggest that answer. The Gemara is going to say something strange here. And there's a double conversation going on here, and there's a reason for that. And they're going to suggest two reasons. The first one we'll see will be rejected. The second one they're going to accept. That's just also methodologically in terms of how to learn Mishnah and then how to learn what the Gemara does to the Mishnah. It's always important to think about the Mishnah on your own first before you read what the Gemara does with it. It's one of the weaknesses, even though Kahati is an excellent commentary on the Mishnah. When you read it, Kahati always explains the Mishnah based on the commentary of the Gemara. So if you start learning the Mishnah and read it only with Kahati, you kind of get pulled into that interpretation and don't always think on your own about what possibly the Mishnah could be meaning without that. So it's always good when you're learning Mishnah to kind of first think about it. Now, before we even go on to the halacha, I also want to stop, and I see someone asked, and it's something that Ayala brought up in her shiur, which is why, if we're talking about stolen items, why do we start immediately with two people fighting over I'm sorry, if we're talking about lost items, did I say stolen? I'm not even sure. But we're talking about lost items. And the second chapter, let's talk about what's going to be. The second chapter starts off with, these are lost items you find that you can keep for yourself. And these are lost items that you have to return to the original owner. And that's really the question when it comes to finding a lost item. If you look in the Torah, and this is what Ayala pointed out, you look in the Torah, what is the Torah's main thing about returning a lost item? You can't ignore it. Don't walk by the street, see something lost, and just say, oh, this is not my responsibility, and walk away. The main thing about lost items in the Torah is your responsibility to return it to the original owner. So if we're talking about lost items here, why are we all of a sudden talking about two people fighting over a lost item they found without discussing what about returning it to its original owner? So it's a good question. And in fact, in Mishnat Eretz Yisrael, which is a book I like to quote, you can find it on Safari. It's in Hebrew only right now, but it's an academic book on the Mishnah. And he says the Mishnah doesn't always start in the right order. And in fact, we see a lot of places. Okay, for example, we'll get to Masechet Makot, where it starts off with, it's about Edim Zomamim, and it says, what cases are exceptions to the rule before it gets later on into what is an Eid Zomem. You would think it would start there, and it doesn't. And he simply dismisses it by saying, well, sometimes it just starts out of order. Okay, and that's one way to look at it. It's obviously not the most satisfactory answer because you'd rather have an answer that has some meaning to it. So both Tosfot and the Rosh connect it to the previous Masechet. And they say that this is kind of the transition. And it transitions from one to the other. Now, again, I'll remind you, and this is also important to talk about in the beginning of Masechet Bava Metzia, what does Bava Metzia mean? The middle gate. And Bava Kama is the first gate, and Bava Batra is the last gate. And basically, this used to be one entire Masechet. In fact, we even saw an opinion that perhaps all of Seder Nezikin was one Masechet and not 8 separate Masechtot. Anyone who has bookmarks can go count how many you have. It's 8. But let's go with the opinion that at least Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Batra were all one long Masechet. Still, you can talk about transitions from one chapter to another, and that there's a transition here, whether it's between Masechtot or whether it's within one long Masechet, but there's a transition here. We've been talking about damages, and as I said, we're going to move into other things, but there's a transition, and we'll talk about this also at the Siyum, which is we end with taking a case of theft and then moving into when someone is considered stealing, when you basically you give your items to somebody to sew clothing or clean your clothing, and parts of it come off and then they keep it for themselves, or does it go to you? Does it go to them? Whose is it? Who's the actual owner of it? And from there, they segue into our case, which is, again, difference of opinion about an item. Okay, so Tosfot says it, that because it talked about there, which one belongs to who, also here it talked about in Tosfot words, it is dinei chalukot, which is who gets what and how we divide property. That's kind of deliberating about. And at the end of the Masechet, if you learned that, you'll see, and we'll see at the Siyum also, these differences of how we just determine how we divide it. And here also, how do we determine how do we divide things? And then from there, it gets into laws of lost items. It wasn't that they came with this agenda of we're going to talk about lost items. It was that they were doing there, they moved to there, and from there they got to there, kind of like an associative connection, which, by the way, since the Mishnah were memorized by heart, it makes sense that they did these associative connections. We've seen that also many times. The Rush says a little differently, which is we ended with theft. That was the real topic of the last number of chapters of Masechet Bava Kama. And basically what we're doing here is there's possibly theft here, okay? Which is, again, there's 2 ways to look at it, which is, are we dealing with just issues between people who, maybe they both legitimately are owed this, or do we look at this more like there's a concern that someone's actually a thief here, okay? And that someone, what's the issue? Let's say we find this lost item and you find it a minute before me, and then I can go grab it and say, hey, this is mine. So I figure, what's to lose? Maybe I'll be able to get half of it. And it could be I'm really stealing something that was rightfully yours. So he connects it to the thief theme, whereas Tosfot connects it more to division of items in question. Okay, so either which way, those are some possible answers. In any case, let's go back to our Mishna. So Shnayim Ochazim b'tallit. So we have these 2 people, they're fighting. This one says, I found it. This one says, it's all mine. This one says, it's all mine. So what do? Each one has to take an oath that they don't own any less than half. It's a very weird language. Okay, we'll get into that later, but they basically each have to take an oath about half, and then yachloku, and then we split it. Okay, so either that means we cut it in half if there's value to, if the 2 halves will be equal to, we won't lose value if we cut it in half, or we sell it and divide the value between the 2 people. Now we're going to have a variation of this case. One says the whole thing is mine, and the other one says, I agree that half of it is yours, but the other half I say is mine. Okay, so I agree that you own half of it. You say all, I say half, but the other half is mine. So really, half of it is clear belongs to person A. The other half, if we're going to do the same thing based on the original law in the Mishnah, that we split it 50-50, we split the part that's in doubt 50-50. So you're going to end up, one person's going to get 3/4 and the other person's going to get 1/4. So that's what we're going to read now. Ha'omel kula sheli, the one who says the whole thing is mine, yishava she'ein lo ba pachot mishlosha chalakim, has to take an oath that 3/4 at least is theirs. And the other person has to take an oath and say, at least 1/4 is mine. And then one will get 3/4 and one will get 1/4. A question is asked. I see you're asking why they have to take an oath. That's a question we're going to get into in the Gemara. But here's a good question. Why does, if really all they're arguing about is half, why doesn't each one take an oath on 1/4? Why does the person who the first half is agreed upon, why does that person need to take an oath about the first half? So one of the commentaries answered, which is that, well, if they take an oath on a quarter and they say no less than a quarter is mine, they could be taking an oath on the quarter that is definitely theirs. They could do this kind of fake oath and pretend like they're taking an oath on the other quarter. So we make them take an oath on the whole 3 quarters so that there's no monkey business going on, and they try to use this to lie under oath, but not really lie, right? Kind of do it in a truthful way, which is really lying about. So that's a possible explanation. Okay, we started with the tallit case. We had 2 variations of it. Now we're going to do, instead of a variation on the kula, we did the kula and the chetzi. Now we're going to do a different variation. We're going to change a different parameter. It's not a tallit, but it's an animal. 2 people riding on an animal. We now learn about different ways of acquiring animals. With a tallit, an object, so if you're holding it and you lifted it, that is a way of acquiring. We learned a lot about that in Kiddushin and in other places as well. So that's a method of acquiring. But, and we're going to get into kinyanim also in Bava Metzia. But on riding an animal, if you want to have rights to an animal and acquire rights to it, so one way is to be riding on it. So if both are riding on the same animal, that gives each also rights to half of it. Or one is riding and one is leading the animal. Leading the animal is also a way of acquiring the animal. So either which way, same thing, they each say, this is all completely mine, this is completely mine. Again, each one, same law, takes an oath that at least half belongs to them, and they split it. Here comes one other thing, which is bisman shehem modin. If each one agrees that each one is holding half, whether it's the animal or riding on the animal, or each one is holding half a tallit, and each one says, oh yeah, I agree with you that you own the other, you grab the other half. We both grabbed it at the same time. Sheyesh lahem edim, or there are witnesses. And I claim it's all mine, you claim it's all yours, but witnesses came and said, we saw you both pick up this lost item at the same time. Holkim below shvuah. In that case, you don't need an oath. Okay, we still don't really know why you need the oath, and we're going to wait for the Gemara to help us understand that, but that's the halach. So we have a din basically that we split it 50-50, but in most cases, except for that very last one, you're going to have to take an oath to be able to get your half. Now the Gemara is going to start off with our first question, and then we're going to get to the issue of the oath. So lamali lamitna ze omer ani mitzatia v'ze omer ani mitzatia ze omer kula shali v'ze omer kula shali litne chada. Why couldn't it have just said either kula shali, or ani mitzatia? If you notice, by the way, in the end of the Mishna, when they bring the case of the animal, they just say kula shali. They don't bring ani mitzatia and kula shali. So why in the beginning do they bring these 2 cases? Is it 2 cases? Is it 1 case? What are they trying to tell us? So the Gemara says, Hada Katani. They're really talking about 1 case. It's really all 1 case. Ze omer ani mitzatia v'kula shali, v'ze omer ani mitzatia v'kula shali. Really, each one says, I found it and it's completely mine. And the other one says, I found it and it's completely mine. To which the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, why didn't it just say, v'litne ani mitzatia v'ani yadana de kula shali? If I come in and say, I found this, then I'm basically saying it's all mine. And itan ani mitzatia, so now they're going to say, well, if you just had the words ani mitzatia, that wouldn't have been enough. Because if the Mishnah said that I said I found it, hava amina my mitzitia ri'itia af agav delo ate liyade b'ri'ia ba'al makani. I might have mistakenly thought if it just said I found it. Okay, I'm going to give you an example. You walk into a bakery and there's 1 croissant left, and you see the croissant and you're going for it. And before you get there, someone walks into the store, they walk in very quickly and they grab the croissant. Okay, now you say, but I saw that croissant. Now, does seeing mean anything? No. And that's why the Mishnah didn't say ani mitzatia, because ani mitzatia, I found it. I found it could mean, right? I found it because I saw it with my eyes. I'll give you another example, right? The more classic example, a parking spot. I always go back to that example, right? A parking spot. I see a parking spot and then someone comes the other way and illegally, turns into the spot before me. So I can claim I saw it first, but if they pull in, they pull in. I didn't want to use that example first because it's not actually picking something up, and grabbing an object, but it's also taking ownership, so to speak, of the space. So what they're trying to tell you is if you just said ani mitzatia, I found it, we might have mistakenly thought that find means with my eyes only, and that's enough to claim this is mine. And therefore, they said, Tana kula shali, Therefore, you needed not only ani mitzatia, but it's all mine. How does it become all mine? Only if I did some active acquiring, which is I actually lifted it. And then it's to teach you deberia lokane. It's not enough to just see something. To which the Gemara says, why would I have even thought that finding something would mean seeing only? Rabbanit already explained in the pasuk where it talks about finding a lost item and having, and not ignoring it. Lo tuchal tallit, you can't ignore it. Sefer Devarim, it says umitzata, okay, l'chol avedat achicha, any aveda asher tovav mimenu, that will be lost from someone, umitzata, and you find it. And he says, when it means and you find it, what it means actually is doesn't mean you just see it. If you pick it up, okay, what this means is really, if I pick up a lost item, then lo tuchal tallit, I can't ignore it. But if I just see it, it's not such a problem to ignore. It's more a problem if I lift it, then I can't just take it for myself. I have to look for its original owner. Obviously, that's in the case, like I said, we're going to get to Bava in the second chapter. When do I need to return it to its original owner? When don't, right? I'll give you some basic example. Like I find a beautiful bracelet on the floor that has identifiable features. Obviously, I need to return that. If I find some cash on the floor or some coins, obviously I don't need to return that because there's no way anyone's going to be able to identify that. And everybody owns the same kind of coins in dollar bills or shekels or whatever it is. So Rabbanit already said that when it says in the Torah mitzata, it means it got to my hands, meaning I already lifted it. Now, if that's the case, why do I need a Mishna to tell me that? If Rabbanit already said that's what the Torah means. So here they have a great answer. In umitzatadikha da'ata liyade mashma umi utano l'shnda almanakid. Umidachazele amar ana eshkachet ba'afagav delo ata liyade b'riya ba'al makane. I'll stop for a minute because it's a long sentence without having translated, but it's still kind of mid-sentence. What they basically say is, which makes a lot of sense, the Torah language is not the same as the rabbinic language. A rabbinic language is sometimes based on the way people spoke in those days. And in the Tanakh, it was much earlier, and they had a different way of speaking. And the Tanakh had a particular way it was written, right? You could take a course in, Hebrew in the time of the Bible and Hebrew in the time of the Gemara. It's a very different language. Or the time of the Mishna, Lashon Chachamim. I actually took a course like that in university. So basically, what we say here is that just because Rabbanit says when the Torah says matzah, it means you actually have to lift it. But the Mishnah used the language people use on the street, which is with finding something is actually just seeing it. And therefore, you would think that maybe b'ri'iyah ba'alma is koneh. That's enough to acquire it for yourself. And that's why the Mishnah had to say kula sheli to b'ri'iyah ba'alma lo kaneh, to teach you that it's not enough. You don't acquire anything just by seeing it. You have no legal rights, monetary rights to it. Okay, so where are we? This was all to explain why it says kula sheli and ani mitzatia. It wanted to teach you this one point, that finding something is not enough to just see it. When you find something and claim rights to it, you have to have lifted it. Otherwise, we have no rights to it. To which the Gemara says, still, it doesn't make so much sense. Because the litne kula sheli v'lo ba'ani mitzatia. You could have just said, have the Mishnah talk about a case where you say, this is mine. And then you don't need the words ani mitzatia. And then you would know that you would have to actually acquire it. V'itani kula sheli, if it had said just kula sheli, I would have thought hava amina, I would have thought be'alma dekatani mitzatia b'riya ba'alma kane. No, because kula sheli wouldn't teach me anything about the word mitzatia. So if I didn't use mitzatia in the Mishnah, you might have thought if you came across mitzatia somewhere else, that might be enough to just see something. And our Mishnah is talking about a case where you lifted something, but doesn't necessarily mean you could theoretically acquire something just by seeing it, because maybe you could. And therefore, that's why you have to put the two words together. Because where you're really learning that mitzatia means you actually have to lift it is by the combination of those two terms being together and the extra language. Okay, this reminds me a little bit of the first Mishnah in Brachot, if you remember. Talks about when do we say Shema at Arvit, and we say the time the Kohanim would eat their truma. And the Gemara says, why don't you just say simply Tzedek Kochavim when the 3 stars come out? It would have been much more clear. And they say, we wanted to teach you something else, right? They like in the Mishnah, or at least the Gemara thinks that the Mishnah is adding things in order to teach us other things. And this would teach us something else about finding items. But now we're going to reject this entire mahalach. Okay, if you're new to Gemara, this is a typical thing to do, which is we spend a long time proving something and then we undo it very easily, which is But how could you possibly say this is one case? Because and if it wanted to say ani mitzatia and kula shali in order to teach you this thing about mitzatia is not ri'tia, that's not enough, then it should have said ze omer ani mitzatia b'kula shali, ze omer ani mitzatia b'kula shali. Why does it say it in this ping pong fashion? He said this, he said that, he said this, he said that. Sounds like two different cases. So they entirely reject this interpretation. And now we're going to explain the Mishnah that there's actually two different cases. Amar Rav Papa, B'itema Rav Shimi B'ashi, V'amri Lachti, it's not clear which one of them said this. Reisha b'Metzia v'Seifa b'Mecha humemka. There's two cases going on here. This isn't just about lost items, which also might possibly answer our question, because the topic here is not lost items. And that's why it didn't start with lost items. The topic is two people fighting over something, either something they found or something they bought. You have to understand, maybe I'll even explain right now, because otherwise it's a little hard to understand what the case of purchasing is. We're going to eventually unravel all the details of this, but the way it works with buying is that two people went to a store. The store owner sold to one of them. The other one wanted the store owner to sell the item to them, but the store owner didn't want to. Either they didn't have any more left, or they didn't like the person who came in and didn't want to. The person gave the money anyway. So you have two people who actually paid the money. We're only going to really figure this out later, but I'll already tell you the case so you follow. Two people gave the money, and now the owner can't remember which was the one he sold to and which was the one he didn't sell to. So now we have these two people each claiming ownership rights to this object. And then, because we're not sure, right, we split it and each one takes an oath. So now we're going to explain why you would need both cases. Because if you're going to say there's two different cases, you have to always explain why the Mishna need to give us two different cases. For this, we're going now to the Amud Bet, the second side of the page. To eat Metzia, and now we're going to basically prove that and now we're going to get to why you need a shvua, okay, why the oath is needed. And we're going to basically say, well, if you had it in this case, you might have thought you wouldn't have needed the oath in that case. And then we're going to do the exact opposite logic. And this is also something the Gemara likes to do, which is flip the logic on its head and try to prove the other logic as well. So itana mitzia, whenever you have it sricha, what it means is you're going to have to say, what if I only had this case? I wouldn't have been able to learn that the other case would have the same law. And then you have to do the flip. What if I only had the other case? And then I wouldn't have been able to learn the first case. So if you had Metzia only, lost item, Hava Amina Metzia hu derame Rabbanit shvua ale. Really, you need the oath. Why? In a Metzia case only. What is the purpose of an oath? So first of all, let's talk about oaths. Oaths, you might remember if you learned Masechet Gittin, we had a whole thing about oaths versus vows and how vows are kind of easier than oaths. Oaths are considered very serious. Often it's using the name of God. Sometimes it's even in the court. And you swear on a Sefer Torah, and it's taken very seriously. And people are very cautious to take oaths, even if they really legitimately can take the oath and they're telling the truth, all the more so if they're lying. Now, we're always worried a little bit that somebody might be lying. So the question is, where do we more likely suspect someone of lying? In a Metzia case or a sale case? And we're going to basically, the first argument is going to say, it would be more logical than in a case where we both find a lost item and you found it, let's say, a minute before me and grabbed it. And then I grab it and claim that I found it at the same time as you or before you. I'm likely lying. Why am I likely lying? And then again, we don't know which one, right? One of us is likely lying. And that's why we make me take an oath. Because an oath is to basically deter liars. Because I might lie and make a claim, figuring I could get away with it. But once they say, take an oath about it, I'm not going to do that. So mishum de more va'amar, because more means you'll justifiably lie about this. Okay, again, not under oath, but we're thinking before the oath. And that's why we make the oath so that you don't lie under oath. But you would say, look, you found this item just a minute before I did. So therefore, it wasn't really yours before. And how many more rights did you have it than I did? So I happened to come a minute later or 5 minutes later or whatever it is. But this wasn't something that was yours to begin with. And therefore, you're lav midi chatzerba. You're not losing anything. You're losing a potential gift that you found. But ezel atbis, I'll grab half of it. Right, I'll grab I'll try to grab as much as I can. And we'll split it 50-50. In other words, and in the end, you'll get 50% more than you would have gotten had you not found this item. So I will be able to rationalize this whole thing. And I'll say, yeah, it's okay that I do this, even though obviously it's not exactly, it's a little deceptive, but I'm not really making you lose anything. Aval mekach umemkar, delekalamem hachi emalo. But mekach umemkar, I'm actually making you lose something. Now, the question is, what am I making you lose in a mekach umemkar case? Because the way I explained it, we both gave money. What's going to happen in the end is, since we both paid money for this item and the seller got double the amount, not sure who paid the money. So in the end, we're going to split the item, assuming everybody takes the oath. We're going to split the item 50-50. Then everyone's going to get back 50% of their money. So you also actually won't lose money. But what are you going to lose? It's not like a lost item where you just happen to find something and picked it up, but you're going to lose an item that you actually went to the store to buy. Presumably, if you went to the store to buy it, you needed it. Now, this is a good question. My daughter had homework this week, and they have a class on trying to think how to translate chinuch financi, like how money works and all that. So they had to make, their homework was make a list of things that you want and things that you need. Okay, want and need are two different things. Okay, you don't always, thanks, financial management, that's the word. Want and need are not always the same, but let's just assume if you're buying something, you must have needed the item. And therefore, by me not allowing you to purchase this item, okay, let's go back to my croissant case. I needed that croissant, but by you purchasing it before me and now I can't get it, right? Or by, let's say, me trying to take it away from you and claiming that it was mine, even though that I really bought, even though no, you really bought it, I'm basically depriving you of that croissant. And that is something you either, again, wanted or needed, but either which way, I'm depriving you of something, whereas a lost item, it wasn't something that you were planning to buy anyway. You just happened to get lucky. So therefore, it's more likely I'll rationalize lying in the Metzia case, but I won't necessarily do that to you in the case of a sale. Let's do the reverse logic now. Why am I more likely lying in the purchasing case and not in the other? Well, if we just had the case of mekach umemkar, I might have thought in that case you need to take an oath, but not in the case of a Metzia. So again, we're just doing the flip logic because the whole question is, why do you need both cases? You might have thought, Hudarame Rabbanan Shvuale. That's why you need an oath. Mishum de more ba'amar, because again, you'll rationalize and say, Chavre dami kayav, va'ana dami kayav. We both gave money. Hashta d'tzricha l'didi, since I need it, eshkale ana, I'll take it. V'chavre leza litrach lesbin. In other words, we both wanted to buy a croissant. So look, you actually bought it, but what's the difference? I'll take it. You gave money. You're going to get your money back anyway, and you'll go to the store down the block and you'll find a croissant somewhere else. Aval Metzia, but when it comes to a lost item, to lekalamem or hachi, you can't just go to the next street and expect to find the exact same lost item on the street. Where in this case, I'll actually be depriving you of something that you're not going to be able to find anywhere else. Emalo, maybe then I won't rationalize it. So srif, okay, and therefore we're going to have a need to have both cases, and that ends that section basically. Except that we have one more question, which it's really not a question anymore because I already told you this, but assume you didn't know this before. Mekach umemkar, I don't understand the case. Why don't we just figure out, okay, nowadays you would use a camera in the store and see who's the one who gave the money and we'd be able to figure it out. Assuming in those days, well, you just ask the seller, who'd you get money from? Lotzricha, it must be talking about a case, denaka mitravayu. And that's why we had to come to this weird kind of case where both of them actually gave the money for the item. Mechad midate umechad al korche, one willing and one against the will of the seller. Below yadana, but then the seller couldn't remember mihu midate umihu ba'al korche, which was the one he sold to willingly and which was the one he sold to unwillingly. Okay, and that ends our first section of the daf, which was trying to establish, after we got through the cases of the Mishnah, we now have to establish these two lines, Zeomer ani Metzia and Zeomer ani Metzia and Zeomer kula sheli and Zeomer kula sheli. Is it one case, which we thought, and then why the double language to teach you some side issue, or it's which they then reject, and then they say it really is two cases, and it's teaching you both mekach umemkar, also a sale, not just lost item. So kula sheli is referring to I bought it and it's completely mine. And ani Metzia is I found it and it's completely mine. So two different cases. Lema manitin to lo keben nanas. Now what the Gemara is going to do is let's look at other cases where we have cases of doubt. Money that we're not sure who it belongs to. And we're going to see there's other machlokot about this, and let's compare them. So the way the Gemara looks at it is to say, hey, we have another case where we're not sure what to do. And the law, according to this guy, rabbi, whose name is Ben Nanas, is different than our Mishnah. So therefore, lema manitin, let's suggest our Mishnah is deloka Ben Nanas. Now, The way it works is that the Mishnah gives cases. The Mishnah doesn't give rules. The Gemara likes to try to put it into general principles because the Gemara wants to say, well, how do we apply this in other cases? So what we're basically going to do is take all different tannatic sources that talk about similar, different cases, and then compare them and say, well, maybe this case is not really the same. And maybe Bananas, who says it there, wouldn't necessarily say the same thing in our case, and therefore would maybe agree with our Mishnah. So we're going to start by saying that it looks like our Mishnah doesn't match Bananas, and then we're going to do the same thing with Sumchus, and then we're going to try to say, no, it could be those are different cases, and the cases are different in this way, and therefore they might actually, yes, agree with the law in our Mishnah. So Lema Manitin de Bananas. Notice also that the Mishnah says this blanket statement without saying who it's attributed to. So that's why also they're kind of struggling to figure out who does this go with. Bananas gives an example, and if you look in Rashi, Deloke Bananas in the third or fourth line in that Rashi, if the Balabai goes to a storekeeper, I'm not going to read this inside, but you can look inside if you want, goes to a storekeeper and says, listen, I'll skip the first case, I'll go to the second, goes to a storekeeper who we assume the storekeeper has more money at hand and the person doesn't, says to the storekeeper, listen, can you pay my workers for me? Please give them money, and then I'll pay you back later. And then what happens? The workers come back to the employer and say, the Balabayit, and say, hey, you didn't pay us. And he goes to the storekeeper and he says, did you pay them? And the storekeeper comes and says, hey, I paid them, give me the money. And now we don't know what happened. The storekeeper claims he already paid the workers, and the workers claim they never got the money. So according to Bananas, okay, so let's actually look in what they basically say is each one, according to Tanakama, each one takes an oath to the original owner. The storekeeper says, I swear I paid them. The workers say, we swear we never got paid. And the owner needs to double pay, needs to pay the storekeeper and pay the workers. Okay, we'll get into later why this all, how the rabbis say this. But Bananas says, what are you talking about? If you make them both take an oath, one of them is definitely lying. We're not going to create a situation where we know that people are lying under oath and we're going to accept that. So that's the words that we just said. One of them is definitely lying. We're not going to allow this. So same in our Mishnah. Well, it's not exactly. But right now, the Gemara is going to say it sounds like the same thing in our Mishnah. We're going to allow both people to claim. They're each claiming it's entirely mine. So one of them is lying. Now, in the end, we're only making them take an oath on the half, and the half they're holding in hand. And that's going to be really the difference. But right now, it sounds like you're letting them take an oath when maybe, it's not clear, but maybe one of them is lying because maybe really it fully belongs to one and the other one just came and grabbed it. So they say, Afilu tema Bananas. No, you can explain it according to Bananas as well. Hatam vadai ikashvuachav. In the case with the storekeeper, there's definitely somebody is lying. Can't possibly be that the store owner paid and they didn't get the money. That's not possible. But it could be they each lifted half of it and lifted it at the exact same time, and it could be nobody's lying. And therefore, maybe even Bananas would agree with our Mishnah. Now we're going to do the same thing with Sumchus. Lema manitin de lo kasumchus. De'i kasumchus. What does Sumchus say? Ha'amar mamona mutal b'safek chokim below shvuah. When you have a doubt, you split it without an oath. Now, what does our Mishnah say? You split it with an oath. Sumchus says without an oath. Where did Sumchus say this? So actually in tomorrow's daf that I pre-recorded, I actually quoted a different case, but Rashi quotes a different case. Okay, there's two cases that we've actually learned about, whether there was an ubar fetus that we're not sure about, an animal's fetus. So one is the one I quoted in tomorrow's daf, which is I trade a donkey for a cow, and then before I actually take the cow into my possession, we find, but I already, one person pulled the donkey, so the sale is a valid sale, but we didn't move we didn't take the parah into my property yet, and then there's a ubar, there's a fetus, and we don't know, is it before the sale or after the sale? And there the Gemara tries to say, oh, they split it 50-50, and that must be Sumchus. But Rashi quotes this other case, which is more the basic case, which is the case of Shor Nagachat Parah. And then they also find a fetus. And the question is, with the fetus, they find a fetus of the baby, they find a dead animal fetus. And the question is, was it because of the goring or was it dead before? Okay. And then the question is, does the owner of the ox have to pay the damages? So their Sumchus says it's split 50-50. Okay, how the 50-50 there, it's a little bit more complicated, but that's the first Mishnah in the 5th parak of Bava. So he says you split it, nobody takes an oath. So elamai, so then they say, wait a minute. Well, the rabbis disagree with Sumchus, because what do they say? We don't split the money 50-50. We say hamotzi mechavero alav haraya. The one who wants to take money out of the hands of the other has the burden of proof on them. So if you want to get the owner of the ox to pay you, well, the burden of proof is on you. And if you don't have proof that the animal was still in utero and therefore you should get paid, well, as long as you don't have proof, you don't get paid. So now we're going to say, okay, well, that doesn't match our Mishnah either. We don't say whoever, right, the burden of proof is on, first of all, you don't need, what does it mean, the burden of proof? Witnesses. In our case, you don't need witnesses. Everybody just takes an oath. There's no need for witnesses. So it doesn't seem to match either one. So first we tried to say it's not like Sumchus, but then we say it's really not like the rabbis. So hi, my. So which is it? To which the Gemara says, well, it actually works better for the rabbis, but then they'll actually justify that it's like Sumchus also, just like they did with Ben Namas. And they're going to differentiate between the cases. So they're going to say the following. If you're going to say it's the rabbis, Rabbanan, hatam de lo tafse travayu. When the rabbis say that's because it wasn't a case where both of them were holding on to something. And then Amre Rabbanan hamotzim mechaver alav haraya. When there's money in the hands of the owner of the ox and the owner of the cow is trying to get the money out, well, then the burden of proof is on the owner of the cow. But hacha, in our case, travayu tafse. They're each holding half of it. Each one has already half in their hand. Therefore, palgela b'shvua. That's why we're going to split it with an oath. But if you try to say it matches Sumchus, hashto uma hatam de lo tafse travayu holkim below shvua. In the case there with the ox and the cow, they're not even holding the money, and yet we say you split it 50-50, and there's no need for an oath. So hacha de travayu tafse la kol sheken. All the more so in our case, they should split it without needing any oath. We should just say, oh, you're holding half, split it. And this is what, someone asked earlier in the chat. Why on earth do you need an oath? And for sure, for Sumchus, there would be no need for an oath. So now we're going to have to try to explain why possibly Sumchus would require an oath in our case. So the first answer, they're going to at least partially reject, though somewhat accept it, but depending on what you hold about Sumchus, and this is based on a machloket that appears elsewhere, which is, afilu tema Sumchus. You could explain it like Sumchus, because Yamar Sumchus, when Sumchus says you split without an oath, that's a case of Shema v'Shema. What happened in this case of the fetus? Nobody knows the truth. They're each just claiming what's a better claim for them. I think it was born before. I think it was born after, because each one wants to win the case. But and basically says, until you can prove otherwise, maybe accept my claim. But nobody has a definitive claim. But in this case, they're each saying, I picked this up. I know what happened here. That's different. That's called bari ubari. And maybe when he says split without an oath, that's only when we have no idea, and neither side really has any idea. And then we just say, split 50-50, no need for an oath. But if each one comes with a definitive claim, which means maybe really there's more likelihood that one side is lying, then maybe even Sumchus will require an oath. Well, that's a partially good answer, because L'Rabba bar Rav Huna, de Amar Sumchus hafilu bari ubari, de Amar Sumchus hafilu bari ubari ma'ika lamema. But we already know that Rabba bar Rav Huna says about Sumchus that Sumchus even says you split without an oath, even in a case where each side is definitive in their claim. And then you really can't explain our Mishnah according to Sumchus. Or maybe you can, but right now it seems like you can't. So how can we explain it? Well, they say, Ki Amar Sumchus hecha di'ika drara de mamona. And we'll go with Rashi on what drara de mamona means. There's two different interpretations, but we'll stick with Rashi. Rashi says that when Sumchus says we split without an oath, that's when there's a financial loss. Okay, like in the case of the para and the cow and the ox. One is going to lose money, right? One is going to have to pay money, or one lost the value of their animal without getting compensated for it. So if there's a loss, then you're going to split it without an oath. But in our case, there is no loss, because remember, if it's a Metzia case, so they just found it. It wasn't like it was theirs and they're losing. If it's a sale, they're each going to get their money back anyway. In other words, they'll each get 50%, and then they'll get 50% of their money back. So then, therefore, in that case, you would need an oath, to which the Gemara says, what? The logic is the exact opposite. The lav kavachomer, who would you just say that's a kavachomer? The opposite would be true. If mahatam di'ika drara de mamona lamar v'ika drara de mamona lamar, where potentially one is completely losing out Right? Either it's not at all yours or it's completely the other one's. And yet, Amar Sumchus Mumona Mataba Safek Chokim Below Shvu. I'm moving into tomorrow's daf a little, but let's just finish it because we're mid-sentence. And Sumchus says you split it without an oath, even though one is potentially causing a loss to the other, a complete loss. Then all the more so if there's no loss. What did we say? Why do we make you take an oath? Because we think you're lying. Now, when there's no loss to anybody, well, then all the more so, right? It's much easier when you're not necessarily causing loss for us to just say, oh, let's just split it 50-50 and no one needs to take an oath. That's a lot easier. So that logic falls, and we're going to leave that right now. You'll see in tomorrow's daf, which is Sumchus, we're going to still come up with a different way to explain. The Mishna does work with Sumchus, but at this point, we haven't yet succeeded. So we did two main things after getting through the Mishna today, which was we dealt with why does it have that double language of Zeomer Kulashali and Zeomer Ani Metzia. What do we learn from that? In the end, we learned there's two cases. That's the conclusion after we rejected the first reading. Then we basically took other cases of what we call mamona mutal b'safek, money that we don't know who it belongs to. And we tried to compare the tannatic opinions and try to figure out, is our Mishnah not going along with certain opinions there? And in the end, we came up with a way, or at least we're trying to come up with ways to fit in our Mishnah with all those different interpretations and say that the cases are just different. And you have to understand the nuances of each case to understand why, in this case, we require a shvua. And all that really helped us to understand why there's a need for a shvua, right? Which once we got to Amud Bet, we started understanding what the need for this oath is. And with that, we'll finish for today, wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and welcome to the Masechet, and looking forward to learning this Masechet with you.